Can you hear them, the bells of Paris? In August of 1572, they were not a harbinger of doom. They were the sound of hope, a melody of peace promised to a kingdom that had forgotten its meaning. France was a nation fractured, a body politic bleeding from dozens of wounds inflicted by a decade of religious civil war, Catholic against Protestant or Huguenot, as they were called here, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. The land was saturated with suspicion and grief. But now, a wedding was set to heal the realm. A union between Marguerite de Valois, the king's sister, a Catholic princess, and Henry of Navarre, the charismatic leader of the Huguenot cause. Imagine the scene: a city draped in royal banners, streets teeming with nobles from both factions, their swords sheathed, their animosities supposedly set aside for the celebration. The common folk, weary of war and starved for stability, would have watched with bated breath, praying that this fragile alliance, sealed by the most sacred of vows, would finally end the bloodshed. It was a spectacle of reconciliation, a masterstroke of diplomacy orchestrated by the formidable Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, a symbol that God, in His mercy, was finally smiling upon France again. But history is not a fairy tale. Its pages are often written not in ink, but in blood. The promise of that Parisian summer was a lie. The wedding was not a sacrament of peace, but a meticulously set trap. The bells that rang for the union of two souls would, just days later, become the signal for a slaughter so profound, so utterly savage, that its echo would haunt the conscience of Europe for centuries. The City of Lights was about to be plunged into an infernal darkness. The very air, thick with the scent of wine and roasted meats, would soon be choked with the iron tang of blood and the ash of burning bodies. The Seine, the lifeblood of Paris, would run red, its currents clogged with the corpses of men, women, and children who had dared to believe in the king's peace. They came to Paris for a wedding. They found their graves. What turns a celebration into a charnel house? How does a royal vow of unity become the prelude to a state-sponsored extermination? This is not simply a story of religious hatred, though that is the fire that fueled the inferno. It is a story of power, fear, and the chilling calculations made in the gilded chambers of the Louvre Palace. It is the story of a weak, paranoid king, a formidable, manipulative queen mother, and a court where a single whisper could seal the fate of thousands. Before the first bell tolled for murder, a decision was made, a choice to sacrifice a minority for the illusion of order. We are about to descend into the heart of that decision, into the anatomy of a massacre that began not with a sword thrust, but with a royal command. Welcome to the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. To understand the horrors of August 1572, we must first journey back through a decade of relentless conflict. France was a kingdom spiritually at war with itself. The Protestant Reformation had swept across Europe, and in France, its followers, the Huguenots, had grown into a formidable minority. They were not merely a theological faction. They were a political and military power, counting among their numbers influential nobles, skilled artisans, and a significant portion of the burgeoning middle class. Their leader, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, was a man of immense stature and military prowess, a respected figure who had earned a place on the king's royal council. This very influence was a source of profound anxiety for the Catholic majority and its powerful patrons, chief among them the ultra-Catholic House of Guise, who viewed the Huguenots as heretics poisoning the soul of the most Christian kingdom of France. They saw Coligny's sway over the young King Charles IX as a direct threat to their power and the religious purity of the realm. The kingdom was a tinderbox, littered with the dry kindling of theological hatred, political rivalry, and personal vendettas. Into this powder keg steps Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, a Florentine noble, often underestimated and caricatured as a scheming poisoner. She was, above all, a pragmatist. Her primary goal was not the extermination of Protestantism, but the preservation of the Valois dynasty through her sons. For years, she had navigated a treacherous path, attempting to balance the Huguenot and Catholic factions against each other to prevent either from overwhelming the crown. The Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1570, which ended the Third War of Religion, was her masterpiece of compromise. It granted the Huguenots significant religious freedoms and political power, a concession that infuriated the hardline Catholics. The marriage of her daughter Marguerite to the Huguenot leader Henry of Navarre was to be the capstone of this policy of reconciliation, a public, undeniable symbol that the wars were over. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that by bringing the Huguenot leadership into the heart of Catholic Paris, she could domesticate them, bind them to the crown, and forge a lasting peace. But in her calculation, she underestimated the volatility of the materials she was working with. She brought fire and gunpowder together in the same room, hoping a wedding ring could prevent the explosion. The contradiction at the heart of this moment was the chasm between appearance and reality. The appearance was one of unity. The reality was a city seething with resentment. Parisian priests delivered fiery sermons from the pulpits, denouncing the heretic wedding and the presence of the Huguenot devils in their holy city. The common people, whipped into a frenzy of piety and paranoia, looked upon the visiting Huguenot nobles with a mixture of awe and disgust. Furthermore, Admiral Coligny was actively pushing for a French military intervention in the Netherlands to support the Protestant Dutch revolt against Catholic Spain. This plan was anathema to Catherine, who feared it would drag a weakened France into a disastrous war with the mighty Spanish Empire. Coligny's influence over her son, the king, was becoming not just a political nuisance, but a direct threat to the stability of the state. The stage was set for a tragedy. The motivations were a toxic brew. The Guise family's thirst for revenge for the death of their patriarch, allegedly orchestrated by Coligny years earlier. Catherine's fear of losing control over her son and her kingdom to war, and the simmering, fanatical hatred of a populace convinced they were doing God's work. The wedding was merely the occasion. The massacre was the culmination of a decade of poison that had seeped into the very soul of France. The wedding ceremony on August 18th was a masterpiece of strained compromise. Since Henry of Navarre, as a Huguenot, could not enter a Catholic cathedral for Mass, the vows were exchanged on a platform erected in the parvis of Notre Dame. Marguerite, beautiful and solemn, went inside with the Catholic court for the remainder of the service, while Henry and his Huguenot lords waited outside, a stark visual representation of the kingdom's divide. For 4 days, Paris was a whirlwind of feasts, masques, and tournaments, an uneasy truce held. The laughter in the halls of the Louvre may have been loud, but it did not drown out the whispers in the shadows. The tension was palpable, a string pulled taut, waiting for a single, violent pluck. That moment arrived on the morning of August 22nd. Admiral Coligny was walking home from a council meeting at the Louvre, reading a letter. As he passed a house owned by a retainer of the Guise family, a shot rang out from an upper window. The assassin's arquebus blast was not fatal. One bullet tore off his forefinger, another shattered his left elbow. The admiral, bleeding but composed, pointed to the window from which the smoke still curled. "There," he said calmly, "is where the shot came from." His attendants rushed him to his lodgings at the Hôtel de Béthissy. The assassin, a man named Maurevert, known as the King's Killer, had already escaped on a waiting horse. The peace was broken. The string had snapped. The news spread through Paris like wildfire. The Huguenot nobles, who had come to the city under the king's safe conduct, were enraged. They stormed through the streets, their hands on their swords, demanding justice. They gathered at Coligny's bedside, a grim assembly of hardened warriors, their faces dark with fury. They spoke openly of vengeance, not just against the House of Guise, whom they immediately and correctly suspected, but against anyone who stood in their way. Their threats were loud, public, and filled with the arrogance of men who felt betrayed. They accused the king's own brother, the Duke of Anjou, of complicity. They promised that if the king would not give them justice, they would take it themselves. In that moment, their rage, however justified, sealed their fate. They had shown their teeth, and in doing so, they had terrified the royal court. The king himself, Charles IX, visited the wounded admiral, weeping and swearing to find and punish the perpetrators. "My father," he said to Coligny, "the hurt is yours, but the outrage is mine." Were these the genuine tears of an aggrieved friend, or the crocodile tears of a conspirator? History remains divided. But what is certain is that in the Louvre, fear was rapidly metastasizing into paranoia. Catherine de' Medici saw her carefully constructed peace collapsing into a new, more vicious civil war, one that would begin right outside the palace gates. What would you have done had you been a Huguenot captain in Paris that day? Your leader, a father figure, has been struck down by an assassin's bullet, a clear violation of the royal peace. You are in a city that despises you, surrounded by a populace that considers you a heretic. The men who tried to kill your admiral are among the most powerful in the kingdom, perhaps even related to the king himself. Do you trust the king's promise of justice? A king whose allegiances seem to shift with the political winds? Or do you heed the calls of your comrades for immediate, violent retribution? Do you gather your men, barricade your quarters, and prepare for battle, or do you counsel patience, hoping that the crown's authority will prevail over the thirst for blood? Your every instinct, honed by years of war and betrayal, screams that this is a trap. But to act on that suspicion is to declare war on the crown itself. To do nothing is to risk being slaughtered in your sleep. Ponder that choice. The line between prudence and paranoia, between righteous anger and self-destructive rage. That was the razor's edge upon which thousands of lives now balanced. The 2 days that followed the attempt on Coligny's life were a fever dream of fear and indecision within the Louvre. The palace was a pressure cooker of whispered conferences and frantic meetings. Catherine de' Medici and her cabinet of carnage, the Italian councillors like Albert de Gondi and Louis de Gonzaga, along with the Duke of Anjou, the future King Henry III, and the Marshal de Tavannes, saw the situation spiraling out of their control. The Huguenots were armed, furious, and threatening a private war that would engulf Paris. The Guises were demanding the right to finish Coligny. The Catholic population of Paris, egged on by preachers, was a mob in waiting. Catherine's initial plan, a targeted strike against the Guises to appease the Huguenots, now seemed impossible. A new, far more terrifying logic began to take hold, the logic of the preemptive strike. If war was inevitable, why not choose the time and place? Why not eliminate the entire Huguenot leadership in one swift, decisive blow, while they were all gathered and vulnerable in Paris? It was a monstrous solution, but in the paranoid atmosphere of the court, it began to seem like the only solution. The key to this plan was the king. Charles IX was a fragile, impressionable young man of 22, dominated by his mother, but also genuinely fond of Admiral Coligny, whom he had come to see as a father figure. He vacillated, torn between his affection for the admiral and the relentless pressure from his mother and council. They painted a terrifying picture for him, a Huguenot army at the gates, a plot to kill the entire royal family and place Henry of Navarre on the throne. They told him Coligny was the head of a venomous serpent, and that to spare the head was to doom the kingdom. The war is no longer between the houses of Guise and Coligny, they argued, but a rebellion against you, the king. For hours, Catherine and her allies worked on him, their words a torrent of fear, accusation, and political necessity. Finally, late on the night of August 23rd, Charles snapped, in a fit of rage and terror, cornered and broken. He is said to have leapt to his feet and screamed the infamous words that would unleash hell. Eh bien, soit tuez-les tous, pour qu'il n'en reste pas un pour me le reprocher. Very well, so be it. Kill them all, so that not one is left to reproach me. With that hysterical, terrifying command, the King of France signed the death warrant for thousands of his own subjects. The massacre was no longer a possibility. It was now royal policy. Imagine yourself as Catherine de' Medici in that moment. You are not, perhaps, the monster history has painted you. You are a mother and a queen, and you see your son's throne, the legacy of your entire family, about to be consumed by the fires of a war you can no longer control. Your policy of peace has failed spectacularly. The men you invited to Paris as guests are now a mortal threat. You are surrounded by enemies. Do you hold to your principles of moderation, even if it means the probable destruction of your dynasty and the plunge of your kingdom into chaos? Or do you choose the terrible necessity, the cold, brutal logic of sacrificing the few to save the many, or at least, to save what is yours? Do you manipulate your own fragile son, burdening his soul with a decision of unimaginable horror, because you believe it is the only way to secure his crown? Is this an act of pure evil, or the desperate, pragmatic calculus of power in an age of existential threats? Her choice was made. The gears of the slaughter began to turn, greased by royal authority. The provost of the merchants of Paris was summoned. The city gates were ordered shut and chained, and the militia was armed. The signal was chosen when the bell of the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, near the Louvre, rang the matin bell before dawn. The killing would begin. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 24th, Saint Bartholomew's Day, the city held its breath. The signal bell rang out earlier than planned, a discordant, jarring peal that cut through the night. The first target was Admiral Coligny, the Duke of Guise himself. The admiral's bitterest enemy went to the Hôtel de Béthissy to oversee the work. A group of his men, led by a man known as Besme, forced their way in. They found the wounded admiral in his bedchamber. Coligny, ever composed, faced his killers not with pleas, but with dignity. "Have you finished already?" he asked calmly. He told Besme, "Young man, you should respect my gray hairs and my infirmity." For his defiance, Besme ran him through with a sword and threw his body from the window into the courtyard below. The Duke of Guise, waiting in the darkness, wiped the blood from the dead man's face to confirm his identity. "It is he said, and kicked the corpse. The head was cut off to be sent to the Pope in Rome, a grotesque trophy of the Catholic victory. The decapitated body was then castrated and dragged through the streets by a gleeful mob to be hung by its feet at the public gallows of Montfaucon. The leader of the Huguenots was dead. The slaughter could now begin in earnest. This was not a battle. It was an extermination. The Royal Swiss Guard went through the Louvre Palace itself, hunting down the Huguenot nobles who were guests of the king. They were dragged from their beds, cut down in the corridors, their pleas for mercy ignored. Men who had feasted with the king just hours before were butchered like animals. Simultaneously, the Paris militia, distinguished by white crosses on their hats and white armbands, spread through the city, accompanied by mobs of Catholic citizens. Lists had been drawn up. They knew where the Huguenots lived. They smashed down doors, sparing no one. Men, women, pregnant women, children. The elderly all were cut down. The sounds of that night were a symphony from hell, the tolling of the bells, the splintering of wood, the screams of the dying, the roar of the mob, and the triumphant shouts of "Kill the Huguenots for God and the King." People were stabbed in their beds, thrown from rooftops, and hacked to pieces in the streets. Their bodies were stripped naked and looted. The River Seine became a floating graveyard, the water so thick with corpses that it was said to have turned red. The violence was intimate, personal, and fueled by a terrifying religious ecstasy. Neighbors killed neighbors. Debtors killed their creditors. It was a carnival of death where all social norms were suspended, and murder became a holy act. Let's put you in a room in the Latin Quarter on that night. You are not a noble, not a soldier, just a humble artisan, a printer, perhaps, or a weaver. You and your family are Huguenots. You were awakened not by the church bells for prayer, but by screaming in the street. You look through a crack in the shutters and see your neighbor, a man you have shared bread with, being dragged from his home and butchered on the cobblestones by men you recognize from your own district. The mob is moving down the street, their faces illuminated by torches, their expressions twisted into masks of frenzied hatred. They are chanting. They are coming closer. Your children are awake, crying silently in the corner. You have a small knife from your kitchen, but there are dozens of them outside. The door to your home is old, made of wood. What do? Do you try to hide them in the cellar, praying they pass you by? Do you try to fight, to die on your feet in a futile gesture of defiance? Or do you try to reason with them, to plead for your life and the lives of your children, hoping to find a flicker of humanity in the eyes of the mob? This was the reality for thousands, a choice with no right answer, an encounter with the absolute failure of society to protect its own. What would your final moments be like, trapped between a fanatical mob and the certainty of death? The horrors of St. Bartholomew's Day cannot be explained away simply as an act of religious fervor. To understand how thousands of ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, craftsmen, even women and children could transform into a frenzied killing machine, we must turn to the chilling principles of social psychology. The primary mechanism at play is de-individuation. This is the process where individuals in a large group, particularly under conditions of high arousal and anonymity, lose their sense of personal identity and moral responsibility. The white cross on the hat, the white armband, these were not just identifiers. They were uniforms that stripped away individuality and submerged the self into the collective identity of the mob. In this state, personal guilt is diffused across the group. I am not murdering my neighbor. We are cleansing the city of heretics. The normal internal voice of conscience is drowned out by the roar of the crowd. The psychological barrier that prevents most humans from committing murder simply dissolves. This process is terrifyingly accelerated by dehumanization. For years, Huguenots had been systematically portrayed not as fellow Frenchmen with a different creed, but as a contagion, a plague, a non-human other. Pulpit rhetoric described them as vermin, devils, and a cancer on the body of Catholic France. Once a group is successfully labeled as subhuman, committing violence against them is no longer perceived as murder. It becomes a form of purification, a civic or religious duty. When the Duke of Guise kicked the corpse of Admiral Coligny, it was more than an act of personal vengeance. It was a symbolic statement that this was not the body of a man, but the carcass of an enemy of the state and of God. The citizens hacking a child to death on the street were not, in their own minds, killing a child. They were destroying a future heretic, eradicating a seed of evil before it could sprout. This cognitive reframing is essential for mass atrocities. It provides the moral justification that allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil, not with remorse, but with a sense of righteous purpose. The massacre was a perfect storm where state-sanctioned violence met popular fanaticism, creating a psychological environment where the worst of human impulses were not only permitted, but celebrated as virtuous. Let's zoom in from the mob in the street to the figures in the palace. What was happening inside the minds of Catherine de' Medici and King Charles IX? Modern neuroscience and the psychology of power offer a compelling lens. Power, it's been shown, can change brain function, increasing risk-taking behavior and decreasing empathy for others. Catherine, backed into a corner, was not necessarily acting out of pure malice, but from a place of calculated, albeit extreme, risk management. Her capacity for empathy towards the Huguenot faction was likely overridden by the overwhelming instinct to preserve the monarchy and her family's power, a phenomenon known as goal-oriented cognition, where all moral considerations are subordinated to achieving a primary objective. For King Charles IX, the situation is even more complex. His vacillation and eventual hysterical outburst are classic signs of a brain under extreme cognitive and emotional duress. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making and impulse control, is severely hampered by high levels of stress hormones like cortisol. Charles was bombarded with high stakes, conflicting information, his personal affection for Coligny versus the terrifying prophecies of doom from his mother and council. This created a state of intense cognitive dissonance. The brain, seeking to resolve this unbearable conflict, will often seize upon the most emotionally resonant and seemingly decisive course of action. His scream to kill them all can be seen as a desperate, pathological attempt to resolve an impossible psychological tension, a final, catastrophic failure of his executive function. He wasn't necessarily a monster, but a weak man placed in a position of ultimate power and subjected to unbearable psychological pressure, leading to a decision of monstrous proportions. This is the danger of absolute power invested in a fragile mind. Beyond the individual mind, sociology provides the final piece of the puzzle. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was a classic, albeit extreme, example of scapegoating. 16th century France was a society beset by anxieties, economic hardship, political instability, the lingering trauma of plagues, and the profound social dislocation caused by the Reformation. In such times of widespread stress and confusion, societies often seek a scapegoat, a specific group, that can be blamed for all its problems and whose elimination promises a return to a mythical, purer past. The Huguenots were the perfect scapegoat. They were easily identifiable, economically successful, which bred resentment, and ideologically divergent. Blaming them for France's ills was a simple, emotionally satisfying narrative that offered a clear enemy and a clear solution. Furthermore, economic factors cannot be ignored. Many Catholic nobles and commoners were in debt to wealthy Huguenot merchants and moneylenders. The massacre provided a brutally convenient way to cancel those debts. By killing your creditor, you not only served God and the king, but also wiped your financial slate clean. This sordid economic motive was a powerful undercurrent, mingling with religious piety and political loyalty. The slaughter was, therefore, not just a religious pogrom, it was also a form of violent social and economic readjustment. It illustrates a timeless sociological principle when religious fanaticism intersects with economic resentment and is legitimized by state power. The result is often a catastrophe. The massacre was a system failure on every level: political, psychological, and social, a terrifying demonstration of how quickly the structures of civilization can be dismantled, leaving nothing but raw, tribal violence in their place. The St. Bartholomew's Day. Massacre does not stand alone in the grim annals of human history. It is a chilling echo in a long, dark corridor of atrocities. Change the time, the place, and the names, and the pattern becomes terrifyingly familiar. The same mechanisms of dehumanization that labeled Huguenots as heretics were used by the Hutu power ideologues in Rwanda to label Tutsis as cockroaches before the 1994 genocide. The same state-sponsored propaganda and use of lists that guided the Parisian militia were refined into a bureaucratic system of extermination by the Nazi regime in the Holocaust. In each case, the path to mass murder begins with the same fundamental step: the division of humanity into an us and a them. It begins with words, with the slow, methodical stripping away of the victim's humanity until they are no longer seen as neighbors, colleagues, or fellow citizens, but as an abstraction, a threat, a problem, a contagion that must be eliminated for the health of the body politic. This othering is the universal grammar of genocide. It allows the perpetrators to believe they are not committing a crime, but performing a service. They are healers cutting out a cancer, exterminators clearing out vermin, righteous warriors purifying the world. The massacre in Paris in 1572 serves as a stark 16th-century blueprint for the horrors that would follow in the 20th and 21st centuries. It reminds us that no amount of cultural sophistication, artistic achievement, or religious piety offers immunity from this primal, tribal impulse. The city of Rabelais and Ronsard became a slaughterhouse overnight. This forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. The capacity for such organized hatred is not an anomaly. It is a dormant virus that resides within the social DNA of all societies, waiting for the right combination of fear, charismatic leadership, and political crisis to reactivate it. The bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois are a fire alarm, ringing across the centuries, warning us that the line between civilization and barbarism is perilously thin. The massacre forces upon us one of the most difficult questions in political philosophy: can extreme violence ever be justified for the sake of national unity or state security? Catherine de' Medici and the Royal Council would have argued yes, in their minds. They were faced with a choice between a swift, brutal, and contained act of violence against a dangerous minority, and a prolonged, chaotic civil war that would kill far more people and tear the kingdom apart. They chose what they likely saw as the lesser of two evils, a terrible necessity. This is the classic argument of raison d'etat, the reason of state, which posits that the state's interests, survival, security, order, can override conventional moral laws. It is a logic that has been used by leaders throughout history to justify wars, assassinations, and purges, but the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is a brutal refutation of this logic. The slaughter did not bring peace. It did not create unity. It did the opposite. It shattered any remaining trust between the factions, horrified Protestant Europe, and plunged France into the Fourth War of Religion, followed by a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and an eighth. The violence, intended to be a surgical strike, became a chronic, incurable disease. It proved that you cannot build a stable house on a foundation of corpses. The massacre demonstrates that violence, especially state-sanctioned violence against a segment of its own population, possesses a terrifying momentum. It is almost impossible to control. It legitimizes hatred and creates cycles of revenge that can last for generations. The question then becomes, what is the line between faith and fanaticism? The Parisian mob believed they were acting on faith, carrying out God's will, yet their actions were the very definition of fanaticism. The pursuit of a belief to the point where all other moral considerations, compassion, mercy, the sanctity of life are obliterated. Where does one end and the other begin? The massacre suggests the line is crossed. The moment our love for our own beliefs becomes greater than our love for our fellow human beings. History often focuses on the killers and the victims, but the majority in any atrocity are neither. They are the bystanders. They are the ones who watch from their windows, who hear the screams but do not intervene, who quietly close their shutters and pray the storm passes them by. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not just the work of a few hundred soldiers and a few thousand rabid fanatics. It was enabled by the silence and inaction of tens of thousands more. This brings the question directly to us, the observers of history. Place yourself not in the shoes of a killer or a victim, but of a Catholic bystander in Paris, one who does not hate your Huguenot neighbors but is terrified of the mob. You hear the pounding on their door, you know what is happening. The instinct for self-preservation is overwhelming. To intervene is to risk being labeled a Huguenot sympathizer and being killed yourself. To do nothing is to be complicit in murder through silence. What is the moral obligation of the individual when the state itself has sanctioned barbarism, when the collective has gone mad? This is the bystander's dilemma. It is a choice between physical courage and moral cowardice, between risking your life for another and saving your life at the cost of a piece of your soul. There were heroic exceptions in 1572: Catholics who hid their Huguenot neighbors, bishops who refused to carry out the killing orders in their dioceses, but they were the minority. Most people chose safety. Can we, from the comfort of our century, condemn them, or must we admit that we do not know what we would do, faced with such a terrifying choice? This is the most unsettling power of studying history. It holds up a mirror and asks, who are you? What are you made of? If you had been there, on that bloody August night, would you have been a hero, a villain, or just another person who quietly shut the window? Be honest with yourself. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done? The world of 1572, with its religious wars and royal courts, may seem impossibly distant. But the ghosts of that massacre walk among us today, cloaked in modern attire. The fundamental human tendencies that drove the slaughter are alive and well in the 21st century. Consider the political polarization that grips so many nations. We may no longer be divided by the Catholic Mass versus the Protestant sermon, but we are fiercely divided by political ideologies, cultural identities, and media ecosystems. The pulpits of Parisian priests have been replaced by the algorithms of social media, which are ruthlessly efficient at creating ideological echo chambers and amplifying outrage. These digital platforms, like the fanatical sermons of the 16th century, excel at othering. They constantly feed us content that confirms our biases, portraying those on the other side not as people with different opinions, but as morally bankrupt, dangerous, and fundamentally less than us. The heretic of 1572 is now the libtard, the MAGA cultist, the globalist, the enemy of the people. The language is different, but the psychological function is identical to dehumanize the opposition and make contempt, and even hatred, feel not only acceptable but virtuous. The Parisian mob was a physical entity, bound by geography and fueled by rumor. Today, we have digital mobs. They can form in minutes, crossing continents to swarm, dox, and destroy the reputation and livelihood of anyone deemed to have violated the tribe's orthodoxy. While this digital violence rarely escalates to the physical butchery of 1572, it springs from the same psychological well of de-individuation and righteous anger. The anonymity of a username provides the same shield from personal responsibility as the white cross on a hat. We must ask ourselves, are we participating in these modern-day mobs when we share a meme that caricatures and dehumanizes our political opponents? Are we not, in a small way, sharpening the rhetorical knives that, in another time and place, could become all too real? The technology has changed, but the dark pathways of the human psyche have not. The spirit of the massacre is present every time we choose contempt over conversation and tribal identity over shared humanity. After the initial slaughter, the French crown was faced with a public relations nightmare. How to justify this barbarity to the other courts of Europe and to its own horrified citizens? It did what powerful institutions often do: it created a narrative. It retroactively invented a Huguenot plot to kill the king and seize the state. The massacre, the official story went, was not a pre-planned murder, but a regrettable but necessary act of self-defense to save the kingdom. Medals were struck to celebrate the foiling of the conspiracy. The Pope ordered a Te Deum to be sung in celebration. This was 16th century fake news, a post-facto justification for an atrocity, disseminated by the highest authorities to shape public perception and absolve the state of guilt. It was a chillingly successful campaign of disinformation. This pattern is a timeless tool of authoritarianism. Today, we see states around the world use sophisticated disinformation campaigns to justify crackdowns on minorities, to discredit political opponents, and to incite violence. State-controlled media and armies of online trolls create and amplify false narratives that paint targeted groups as existential threats to national security, cultural purity, or traditional values. The fabricated Huguenot plot of 1572 finds its modern analog in the conspiracy theories about migrant caravans, the lies about stolen elections, or the demonization of journalists as enemies of the state. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre is a terrifying case study in how quickly official lies can become a license to kill. It demonstrates that the most dangerous disinformation is not that which comes from the fringes, but that which is sanctioned and spread by the state itself. It gives the mob not only a reason to hate, but the perceived legal and moral authority to act on that hatred. It reminds us to be radically skeptical of official narratives, especially those that identify a convenient internal enemy as the source of all our problems. The massacre did not end the story of Protestantism in France. It was a brutal chapter, but not the final one. The wars continued for another quarter century, until the unlikeliest of figures brought a measure of peace, Henry of Navarre. The Huguenot leader who had survived the massacre by feigning a conversion to Catholicism eventually became King Henry IV of France. To unite the kingdom, he famously converted to Catholicism for good, declaring that Paris is well worth a mass. But he did not forget his roots. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, a landmark decree of religious toleration that granted Huguenots substantial rights and protections. It was a fragile peace, born from exhaustion, but it held for nearly a century. It was an attempt at reconciliation, an official recognition that two faiths could coexist within one kingdom. However, the ghost of St. Bartholomew's Day was never fully exorcised. The memory of the slaughter lingered, a scar on the national psyche, and in 1685, King Louis XIV, the Sun King, in an act of supreme religious intolerance, revoked the Edict of Nantes. Once again, Protestantism was outlawed. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots, the nation's most skilled artisans, intellectuals, and merchants fled France, a devastating brain drain from which the kingdom never fully recovered. This long, cyclical history of tolerance and intolerance, of massacre and edict, of reconciliation and revocation, holds a profound lesson for our time. It teaches us that peace is not a permanent state. It is a continuous, difficult process. Reconciliation after deep trauma is the work of generations, and it can be undone in a moment of political folly or ideological fervor. The story of the Huguenots reminds us that progress is not inevitable. The rights and protections we take for granted today were won at a terrible price, and they are only as secure as our collective commitment to uphold them against the ever-present specter of fanaticism. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is more than a historical event. It is a cautionary tale etched in blood. It is a story about the terrifying speed at which a society can unravel, and the depths of cruelty that lie dormant beneath the veneer of civilization. It began with a wedding meant to symbolize unity, and ended in a butchery that deepened every divide. It was ordered from the highest echelons of power and executed with glee by the common man in the street. It was a failure of politics, a perversion of faith, and a collapse of human empathy on a scale that shocked the 16th century world. The immediate aftermath saw not peace, but more war, more suffering, more grief. The names of the thousands of victims are mostly lost to us, their final moments unrecorded. Their bodies washed down the Seine or thrown into mass graves. They are the silent, unquiet ghosts of our story. What, then, is the ultimate legacy of this horror? Perhaps it is the stark realization that violence is a poor tool for solving problems of the human spirit. You cannot kill an idea with a sword. You cannot murder a faith by slaughtering its faithful. The massacre, intended to wipe out the Huguenot cause in France, instead created martyrs and hardened the resolve of the survivors. It strengthened, rather than destroyed, the very thing it sought to eliminate. It stands as a monument to the futility of fanaticism, a bloody testament to the fact that unity forged by fear is no unity at all, and that a peace purchased with the blood of a nation's own people is a peace not worth having. The bells of that August night toll still, not as a signal for murder, but as a perpetual warning. The story leaves us with questions that have no easy answers, questions that probe the darkest corners of our own nature. Is the capacity for such collective madness a relic of a more brutal past? Or is it a permanent part of the human condition, waiting for the right triggers in our own polarized world? How do we guard against the slow, creeping process of dehumanization that is the precondition for all atrocities? How do we build societies resilient enough to withstand the siren call of the demagogue who promises purity through persecution? The history of Saint Bartholomew's Day commands us to look at our own societies, at our own politics, and at our own hearts, and to identify the seeds of that same hatred before they can take root and bear their terrible fruit. It asks us to value the difficult, frustrating work of compromise and coexistence over the seductive, simple clarity of fanaticism. It demands that we listen for the echoes of history in the rhetoric of today, and that we have the courage to stand for the humanity of those with whom we disagree, especially when it is most difficult. The victims of 1572 cannot speak for themselves. We are their memory. And the only fitting tribute to their stolen lives is to learn their lesson and to commit ourselves, in our own time, to ensuring that the bells never ring for such a reason again. Their unquiet graves are a charge to the living to be vigilant, to be compassionate, and to remember. The story of the past is never truly over. It informs our present and shapes our future. The dark narratives we explore here are not meant simply to shock or disturb, but to serve as a mirror and a warning. The forces of power, fear, and fanaticism are constants in the human story. By understanding how they converged with such devastating effect in 16th century Paris, we can become more adept at recognizing them in our own world. Thank you for walking with us through this dark chapter of our hidden past. The conversation does not end here. What other historical events do you believe hold urgent lessons for today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that understanding the darkness of the past is essential to protecting the light of the future, please subscribe and join our community of historical inquiry. For the past is never dead. It's not even past.